Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The autumn of 1895 had descended upon London with particular malevolence, wrapping the great metropolis in a shroud of yellow fog, so dense that even the familiar gas lamps of Baker Street appeared as mere phantoms in the murky twilight. I had spent the better part of that November evening attending to the correspondence that invariably accumulated during my friend's more intensive periods of investigation, when the mundane concerns of a medical practice seemed to fade into insignificance beside the intellectual puzzles that so captivated Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Holmes himself sat in his customary chair, his sharp profile illuminated by the dancing flames of our hearth, a thin stream of smoke rising from his pipe as he contemplated some problem known only to himself. The familiar sight of his angular features, set in that expression of intense concentration I had come to know so well, suggested that his restless mind was already at work upon some matter of interest, though no case had presented itself to us for the better part of a week. "You seem unusually pensive this evening, Holmes," I observed, setting aside my pen and noting the peculiar stillness that had settled over our chambers. "Has something particular captured your attention?" My friend turned his grey eyes toward me, and I detected that familiar glint of anticipation that inevitably preceded his most remarkable demonstrations of deductive reasoning. "Indeed, Watson, I have been expecting a visitor for the past quarter hour, though I confess the nature of his business promises to be most intriguing." "A visitor? At this hour and in such weather?" I consulted my pocket watch, which showed nearly 9:30. "What leads you to believe—" My inquiry was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps upon the stairs below, followed by Mrs. Hudson's familiar knock upon our door. "Inspector Lestrade to see you, gentlemen," she announced, though her tone suggested she found the late hour rather irregular. The inspector entered our sitting-room with his characteristic brisk manner, yet I immediately observed that his usually confident demeanour appeared somewhat shaken. His weather-beaten face bore the unmistakable signs of a man who had encountered something that challenged his fundamental understanding of the natural world, and his customary air of professional certainty had given way to an expression of genuine bewilderment. "Holmes, Watson," he began without preamble, declining Mrs. Hudson's offer of tea with an absent wave of his hand. "I've come about a most extraordinary matter, one that has my constables muttering about supernatural nonsense and my superiors questioning whether I've taken leave of my senses." Holmes leaned forward in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that attitude of intense concentration I knew so well. "Pray continue, Lestrade. I find that what the common mind attributes to supernatural agency often proves most illuminating when subjected to rational analysis." The inspector withdrew a leather portfolio from his coat and placed it upon our table with the careful precision of a man handling evidence of the utmost importance. 2 nights ago, Sir Reginald Blackwood was found dead in his locked study at Blackwood Manor in Hampstead. The family physician, Dr. Whitmore, has confirmed that the gentleman died of natural causes. His heart simply ceased to function. Nothing unusual in that, you might think, given that Sir Reginald was approaching his 75th year and had suffered from a weak constitution for some months. But something troubles you beyond a routine death from natural causes, Holmes observed, his keen eyes already studying the portfolio with evident interest. "Indeed." Lestrade opened the case and withdrew several photographs and a detailed sketch of what appeared to be an elegant study lined with leather-bound volumes. Sir Reginald was discovered seated at his writing desk, apparently having passed away peacefully during the night. However, the circumstances surrounding his death present a puzzle that defies all logical explanation. I examined the photographs with growing fascination. The images showed a well-appointed gentleman's study, dominated by a massive oak desk upon which sat an ornate brass candlestick, holding what appeared to be an ordinary beeswax candle, its flame captured as a bright blur in the photograph. "The peculiar thing," Lestrade continued, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper, "is that according to every member of the household staff, this particular candle had been burning continuously in Sir Reginald's study for over a week before his death. Moreover, when we discovered the body at approximately 8 o'clock yesterday morning, the candle was still burning, and it continued to burn for another full day before finally extinguishing itself." The implications of this statement struck me with considerable force. 8 days of continuous burning? Inspector, surely that's quite impossible. Even the finest beeswax candles would be entirely consumed within a matter of hours. "Precisely my thoughts, Doctor," Lestrade replied grimly. "Yet I have the testimony of 4 reliable servants, each of whom swears that the candle has burned without interruption since the evening of November 15th. What's more, when we finally gained entry to the study, the air within was as fresh as a spring morning, despite the room having been sealed for the entire night." Holmes rose from his chair and began that characteristic pacing before the fireplace that invariably signalled his deepest concentration. "Most intriguing indeed. Tell me, Lestrade, you mentioned that the study was locked?" "Locked from the inside, Holmes, with the key still in place. Every window was securely latched, and there is no other means of entry. The chimney was sealed years ago when Sir Reginald had modern heating installed throughout the manor." "And the household?" Holmes inquired, pausing in his circuit to fix the inspector with that penetrating gaze I had witnessed so many times before. "Sir Reginald lived quite simply despite his considerable wealth. The staff consists of Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper who has served the family for over 20 years, Jameson, the butler, Sarah, a housemaid, and young Timothy, who serves as both footman and groundskeeper. All are above suspicion and were accounted for throughout the relevant period." Holmes moved to the window, gazing out into the impenetrable fog that continued to shroud the city. "The scientific impossibility is quite remarkable, Watson. A candle burning in a sealed chamber would rapidly deplete the available oxygen, yet Lestrade describes fresh air and a thriving flame. It suggests either a source of continuous ventilation or—" He paused, his eyes suddenly blazing with that peculiar intensity that marked the beginning of his most brilliant deductions. "Or what, Holmes?" I pressed, sensing that my friend had already begun to perceive some pattern invisible to the rest of us. "Or the most ingenious deception I have yet encountered," he replied softly. "Lestrade, I trust the study remains undisturbed." "Sealed by my express orders, Holmes. Nothing has been touched since we photographed the scene." "Excellent. Watson, I believe our evening has found its purpose." Holmes turned from the window, his face animated with that expression of eager anticipation that never failed to quicken my own pulse. "Inspector, we shall accompany you to Blackwood Manor immediately, for if I am not greatly mistaken, this impossible candle will illuminate one of the most remarkable crimes it has ever been my privilege to investigate." As we prepared to venture into the fog-shrouded night, I found myself studying the photographs once more, that mysterious flame seeming to mock the very foundations of natural law. Little did I suspect that this enigmatic light would lead us into a labyrinth of deception so intricate that even Holmes's remarkable powers of observation would be tested to their utmost limits, or that before our investigation reached its conclusion, we would encounter a mind of such cunning that it might well prove a match for the greatest detective of our age. The game, as my friend would say, was most decidedly afoot. The journey to Hampstead proved treacherous in the extreme, our hansom cab lurching through streets rendered nearly impassable by the oppressive fog that seemed to transform familiar London into an alien landscape of shadows and muffled sounds. Holmes maintained his characteristic intensity throughout our passage, though I observed that his restless energy had found a new focus in the peculiar circumstances awaiting our investigation. "Tell me, Inspector," Holmes said suddenly, breaking the contemplative silence. "You mentioned that Sir Reginald had been in declining health. What was the precise nature of his condition, and had there been any unusual visitors to the manor in recent weeks?" Lestrade consulted his notebook by the dim interior light, his weathered features creased with concentration. According to Dr. Whitmore, the family physician, Sir Reginald had been suffering from what he termed a general weakening of the constitution since late spring. Nothing specific, mind you, but a gradual decline that left the old gentleman increasingly reclusive. He spent most of his time in that study of his, attending to what he called his final arrangements. "His final arrangements?" I interjected, struck by the ominous implications. "Indeed, Doctor. Mrs. Pemberton mentioned that Sir Reginald had been receiving an unusual number of visitors over the past month, at least 3 distinct individuals. A well-dressed but nervous gentleman, a younger man with what she described as foreign features, and most recently a woman of middle years who arrived in a private carriage and spoke with Sir Reginald for nearly 2 hours. Holmes leaned forward with evident interest. "And on the day of his death?" "No visitors that the staff observed, though Sir Reginald had given explicit instructions that he was not to be disturbed after 6 o'clock that evening." As our cab finally drew to a halt before the imposing Georgian facade of Blackwood Manor, Holmes stepped down with that peculiar energy that always preceded his most intensive investigations. Even in the dim light I could observe his keen eyes already cataloguing details, the meticulously maintained grounds, the warm glow of several windows, the subtle signs of a household in mourning. We were met at the entrance by Mrs. Pemberton, a woman of perhaps 60 years whose dignified bearing immediately marked her as a person of considerable character. Her grey hair was arranged in a neat bun, and her black dress bore the subtle indicators of mourning, though her eyes remained alert and composed. "Inspector Lestrade, gentlemen," she said with a slight curtsy. "I have prepared tea in the morning room, though I understand you wish to examine Sir Reginald's study immediately." "Your consideration is much appreciated," Holmes replied courteously. "However, I believe our investigation would benefit from examining the scene while circumstances remain undisturbed. The study has remained sealed since yesterday morning." "Exactly as instructed, sir. No one has entered since the constables completed their examination. I must confess, the entire household finds the situation most distressing." As we followed Mrs. Pemberton through well-appointed corridors lined with family portraits, Holmes paused briefly, his attention caught by seemingly insignificant details. I observed him noting a faint smudge near a marble pedestal, a barely visible scratch on a grandfather clock's polished surface. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said suddenly, "I perceive that you have recently had occasion to dust the upper shelves of the library, and that young Timothy has been particularly diligent in his duties despite the household's distress. Moreover, I deduce that Dr. Whitmore visited the manor yesterday evening, arriving in considerable haste." The housekeeper stopped, her eyes widening with surprise. "Why, yes, Mr. Holmes, I did attend to the library shelves yesterday morning. Sir Reginald was most particular about such things, and Timothy has indeed been working extra hours to maintain the grounds. As for Dr. Whitmore, he did return yesterday evening when he heard of our discovery, though I cannot imagine how you—" "Merely trifling observations," Holmes interrupted gently. "The faint scent of beeswax polish on your sleeve the slight callus on your right hand consistent with recent polishing work, and the unmistakable impression of a medical bag's corner in the hall carpet, still visible despite Timothy's conscientious efforts. We had reached the study door marked with Lestrade's official seals. Holmes bent close to the panels, his nostrils dilating slightly. "Curious," he murmured. "The air is remarkably fresh for a room sealed these many hours." He snapped his fingers sharply, and I noticed the sound returned with an oddly muffled quality. As Lestrade broke the seals and turned the key, Holmes's eyes blazed with that familiar intensity. "Now, Inspector, let us examine this remarkable study and discover what secrets lie hidden within its impossible flame." The door swung open with a measured creak, and immediately I was struck by the most peculiar sensation. The air that greeted us was remarkably fresh, devoid of the stale atmosphere one would expect from a chamber sealed for over 30 hours. Holmes stepped across the threshold with that characteristic delicacy he employed at all crime scenes, his head tilted slightly as though listening to sounds audible only to his extraordinary senses. Sir Reginald's study presented itself as the very model of a gentleman's scholar's retreat. Mahogany shelves lined 3 walls, their leather-bound volumes climbing toward an ornate plaster cornice, while Persian carpets of obvious quality covered the polished oak floors. The massive Chippendale desk dominated the room's centre, and upon it sat the brass candlestick that had so confounded Inspector Lestrade, though now, mercifully, the flame had finally extinguished, leaving only a pool of hardened wax and the faintest trace of smoke lingering in the still air. "The body was removed yesterday afternoon," Lestrade explained, indicating the high-backed leather chair positioned before the desk. Sir Reginald was discovered slumped forward, his right hand resting upon an open ledger. Dr. Whitmore confirmed death had occurred between midnight and 3 o'clock in the morning. Holmes began his examination with that methodical precision I had witnessed countless times before, yet something in his manner suggested he was already perceiving patterns invisible to our ordinary observation. He circled the desk without touching anything, his keen eyes cataloguing details with the intensity of a naturalist studying some rare specimen. "Watson," he said suddenly, "what strikes you as most remarkable about this chamber's atmosphere?" I considered the question carefully, drawing upon years of medical training and investigative collaboration. "The air is extraordinarily fresh, Holmes. There's no trace of the stuffiness one would expect from a sealed room, particularly one that contained a burning flame for such an extended period." "Precisely." Holmes knelt beside the candlestick, his magnifying glass emerging from his waistcoat pocket. "Observe the wax pool, Inspector. These concentric rings in the hardened wax, each represents approximately 12 hours of continuous burning. I count no fewer than 8 distinct formations, confirming the household staff's testimony regarding duration." The implications struck me with considerable force. "Then we have evidence of continuous combustion for over a week, yet the physical impossibility remains. A candle burning in a truly sealed chamber would have exhausted the available oxygen within hours." Holmes rose, his attention now focused upon the room's architectural features with renewed intensity. He moved to the single window, examining the latch mechanism, then inspected the sealed chimney that Mrs. Pemberton had mentioned. His nostrils dilated slightly as he struck a match and held it several inches from the wall. "Curious," he murmured, watching the thin stream of smoke. Instead of rising straight upward, it drew sideways in a delicate current toward the skirting behind the desk. "A draught, gentlemen, and not a trivial one." Lestrade made a sound of impatience. "If there's some hidden crack, Holmes, we've examined every inch of this room. The windows are latched, the chimney was bricked up years ago when Sir Reginald installed modern heating." Holmes had already knelt at the skirting board, his penknife blade tracing along what I had taken for merely decorative moulding. Under his persuasion, the painted surface revealed itself to be a thin row of perforations, neatly drilled and overlaid with paint matching the wainscot's hue. He placed his palm against the concealed vents and smiled with evident satisfaction. Warm air, drawing steadily. The modern heating system, Inspector, has been adapted for ventilation. A gentleman of failing health might insist upon such a contrivance for the sake of his constitution. Holmes's eyes blazed with that familiar intensity. This explains our spring fresh air in November and removes any supernatural agency from our consideration. The impossibility becomes merely improbable. I felt a surge of admiration for my friend's deductive powers, yet something in his manner suggested this discovery represented only the beginning of our investigation. Holmes now turned his attention to the candlestick itself, lifting it carefully with his handkerchief and peering into the brass cup with his lens. "Watson, your medical eye, if you please." I examined the interior surface and observed a faint, crystalline residue along the inner wall, as though dried from some solution. Holmes scraped a grain with his pin and touched it to his tongue. "Saltpetre," he pronounced. "The wick has been chemically treated. It would burn with remarkable persistence and produce minimal smoke. Note also the unusual neatness of the wax formation. Very little guttering for such extended combustion. A specially prepared candle." Lestrade's eyebrows rose with dawning comprehension. "A candle adapted to serve a very specific purpose," Holmes confirmed, setting the candlestick down with careful precision. He moved to examine the study door, his lens hovering over the brass escutcheon. "Here we find additional evidence of manipulation, a smear of tallow where no finger should naturally rest, and these minute scratches radiating from the keyhole." The inspector frowned deeply. "You suggest the door was locked from outside the room?" "I suggest, Inspector, that appearances may prove deceiving when sufficient ingenuity is applied to their creation." Holmes knelt at the threshold, drawing back the heavy rug to reveal faint scuff marks upon the oak flooring and something thread-like lodged beneath the door's edge. He extracted the filament with his tweezers and held it to the light. Fishing gut of the finest quality. As Holmes continued his examination, moving systematically through the study's contents, I found myself marveling at the complexity of deception that was gradually revealing itself. The impossible candle was indeed proving to be an ingenious illusion, yet I sensed that we had uncovered merely the surface of a far more intricate design. "The scientific impossibility has been explained," Holmes announced, straightening from his inspection of an ornate iron safe set into the wall. "But the human element, the why and the who, remains our true challenge. Mrs. Pemberton mentioned 3 recent visitors to Sir Reginald. I believe the time has come to examine their roles in this carefully orchestrated deception." Holmes moved to summon Mrs. Pemberton with a gentle pull of the bell cord, and within moments the housekeeper appeared with that quiet efficiency that marked her long years of service. Her composed demeanour remained intact, though I detected a subtle tension in her bearing, as Holmes gestured toward the chair beside Sir Reginald's desk. "Mrs. Pemberton," Holmes began with characteristic directness, "you mentioned the recent installation of ventilation in this study. Pray tell us more about the engineer who performed this work." The housekeeper's hands folded carefully in her lap as she considered her response. "A foreign gentleman, Mr. Holmes, though he spoke English well enough. Dark-featured, with a small scar upon his chin. He arrived with proper credentials and spent the better part of an afternoon modifying the heating registers. Sir Reginald was most particular about the work, insisting the air flow freely to ease his breathing difficulties. And the 3 visitors you mentioned to Inspector Lestrade? Yes, sir. First came Mr. Lionel Avery, Sir Reginald's solicitor, a nervous gentleman who brought legal documents on 2 separate occasions. Then the engineer I described, who gave his name as Mr. Caelan Var, and claimed distant kinship with the family. Finally, Mrs. Lydia Mortlake, a well-dressed lady of middle years who arrived in a private carriage. Her interview with Sir Reginald lasted nearly 2 hours, and both emerged with evident distress. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then moved to examine the ornate wall safe more closely. His magnifying glass revealed fresh scratches around the combination dial and traces of what appeared to be chalk dust marking specific numerals. "Someone has accessed this safe recently, Mrs. Pemberton. The scratches are quite fresh, and these chalk marks suggest the combination was noted for easy reference." The housekeeper's eyes widened with surprise. "But, sir, only Sir Reginald knew those numbers. He was most secretive about his private papers." "Indeed." Holmes straightened and approached the leather-bound ledger that lay open upon the desk. With practiced skill, he shaded the blotter beneath with a pencil, revealing the ghostly impressions of recent writing. The revealed text spoke of arrangements, payments, and a cryptic reference to someone identified only as M.B. Inspector Lestrade peered over Holmes's shoulder as additional details emerged from the indented writing. "Final settlement £500, he read aloud. "That's a considerable sum, Holmes." "Considerable indeed," my friend agreed, turning his attention to the ledger itself. The pages revealed meticulous records of financial transactions extending back several months, with regular payments made to 3 individuals whose initials corresponded precisely to Mrs. Pemberton's mysterious visitors. The final entry, dated the very evening of Sir Reginald's death, showed the substantial payment Lestrade had noted. Holmes summoned Jameson next, and the dignified butler provided crucial information about the household security arrangements. He confirmed that a master key existed for most doors, though it would not operate Sir Reginald's study lock once the interior key was in place. His testimony regarding the untouched brandy tray and the absence of forced entry to either safe or desk corroborated the careful nature of whatever deception had been employed. Young Timothy followed, his honest features betraying nervous energy as he described his duties maintaining the boiler and monitoring the newly installed ventilation system. Holmes questioned him closely about his movements during the crucial evening, noting the young man's familiarity with the heating apparatus and his late-night presence in the corridor outside the study. "The physical evidence tells a fascinating story," Holmes observed once we were alone again. "The fishing gut beneath the door, the tallow smear upon the lock mechanism, the chalk-marked safe combination, all point to a carefully orchestrated deception. The door was indeed locked from the outside, using the fishing gut to manipulate the key through the keyhole, creating the illusion of an impossible sealed chamber." I found myself marveling at the ingenuity of the scheme. "But to what purpose, Holmes? If Sir Reginald died of natural causes, why construct such an elaborate fiction?" "To conceal the true nature of his final arrangements, Watson. These payment records suggest that our 3 visitors were compensated handsomely for services rendered, services that Sir Reginald wished to remain secret even after his death. The impossible candle, the sealed room, the mysterious circumstances, all were designed to focus attention upon the supernatural rather than the very human motives of inheritance and concealment." Holmes moved to the window, his sharp profile silhouetted against the fog-shrouded glass. "The game grows more complex with each revelation, my dear fellow. We have identified our players, Avery the solicitor, Var the engineer, and Mrs. Mortlake, the mysterious beneficiary. Now we must determine which among them possessed both the knowledge and the audacity to transform Sir Reginald's natural death into this elaborate theatrical performance. The candlelight might have died, but its purpose in illuminating a web of human deception had been accomplished with remarkable precision. Holmes had scarcely completed his observation when the sound of carriage wheels upon gravel announced an arrival at Blackwood Manor. Mrs. Pemberton appeared moments later with that composed efficiency that marked her years of service, though I detected a subtle tension beneath her professional demeanour. "Mr. Lionel Avery has arrived, gentlemen," she announced. "He requests an audience regarding certain papers of the late master and awaits your convenience in the morning room." "Most fortuitous," Holmes replied, his eyes brightening with evident satisfaction. "Pray ask Mr. Avery to join us here directly. The study itself may prove more illuminating than any drawing-room conversation." Within minutes, a slight gentleman of perhaps 50 years appeared in the doorway, his prematurely silvered hair arranged with meticulous precision, and his pale eyes, magnified behind rimless spectacles, darting about the chamber with quick, nervous movements. His dark morning coat and striped trousers bore the unmistakable stamp of professional respectability, yet something in his bearing suggested a man labouring under considerable anxiety. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began with a formal bow, his voice carrying the measured cadences of his profession. "Inspector Lestrade, I came as soon as I received word of this tragic business. Sir Reginald was not merely a client, but a gentleman for whom I held the deepest respect." Holmes gestured toward the chair beside Sir Reginald's desk, his keen gaze already cataloguing details that escaped ordinary observation. I noted his particular attention to a faint white residue upon Avery's right cuff, and what appeared to be a reddish smear upon the solicitor's thumb. Observations that seemed to hold special significance for my friend. "Mr. Avery," Holmes began with characteristic directness, "we understand you visited Sir Reginald on multiple occasions this month, most recently on the very evening of his death. The ledger upon this desk indicates a substantial payment made to you at that time." The solicitor's composure wavered almost imperceptibly, a slight flush rising to his pale cheeks. "Quite correct, Mr. Holmes. Sir Reginald had become increasingly concerned about his final arrangements. The payment you mention was my fee for preparing a codicil to his will, a document of some complexity that required considerable legal expertise." "And the nature of this codicil?" Holmes inquired, moving with apparent casualness toward the ornate wall, safe that had drawn his attention earlier. "I am bound by professional confidentiality, naturally," Avery replied, though his nervous glance toward the safe did not escape Holmes's notice. "However, given the circumstances, I can reveal that the codicil provided for certain previously unacknowledged obligations. Sir Reginald was most insistent that these arrangements remain confidential until after his passing." Holmes knelt beside the safe, his magnifying glass revealing fresh scratches around the combination dial and traces of chalk dust marking specific numerals. With methodical precision he began turning the dial, pausing at each chalked number. The mechanism yielded with a soft click, causing Lestrade to utter a sharp exclamation of surprise. "The combination was noted for easy reference," Holmes observed mildly, examining the chalk residue on his fingertips. Someone required frequent access to these contents. The safe's interior revealed several sealed packets, a small tin labelled with chemical notations, and a folded receipt bearing the letterhead of a Limehouse chandler. Holmes examined each item with meticulous care, his trained eye cataloguing every detail. "Potassium nitrate and treated wicking," he murmured, displaying the tin's contents. "The materials for our impossible candle, purchased by a gentleman with a scarred chin, our mysterious engineer, Mr. Varr." Among the packets one bore an elegant inscription, "For Mrs. Lydia Mortlake, upon proper acknowledgement." Another, sealed with black wax, contained the codicil Avery had mentioned. Holmes examined this document with particular attention, his eyebrows rising slightly as he absorbed its contents. "Most illuminating," he pronounced. "Mrs. Mortlake is not merely a beneficiary, but Sir Reginald's natural daughter, a relationship he chose to acknowledge only in his final arrangements. The substantial bequest represents both paternal affection and compensation for years of necessary secrecy." Avery's face had grown quite pale during this revelation. Sir Reginald was most explicit about maintaining discretion. The scandal of an acknowledged natural child, even posthumously, could have damaged the family's reputation considerably. "Indeed," Holmes agreed, returning the documents to their proper places. "Yet someone possessed intimate knowledge of these arrangements, knowledge sufficient to construct an elaborate deception around Sir Reginald's natural death. The question becomes which of our three suspects possessed both the technical skill to create this theatrical impossibility and the ruthless calculation to exploit a dying man's secrets? The candlelight might have died, but its purpose in concealing human avarice and deception had been accomplished with remarkable precision. As Holmes secured the safe once more, I sensed we had uncovered merely the surface of a conspiracy far more complex than its supernatural trappings had initially suggested. Holmes had scarcely secured the safe when he turned his penetrating gaze upon Mr. Avery with that courteous implacability which few men could long resist. His attention fixed particularly upon the faint chalk residue that marked the solicitor's right cuff and the curious vermilion smear adorning his thumb. "You sealed the codicil yourself, I presume?" Holmes inquired with deceptive mildness. Avery inclined his head nervously, adjusting his spectacles with trembling fingers. Sir Reginald initialed the document and impressed his signet ring upon the wax. I applied the sealing compound myself. As for the chalk, you observe. He glanced uneasily toward the safe. Sir Reginald was anxious that I should memorize the combination in case of sudden illness. I tested myself once under his supervision and endeavored to replace everything precisely as I found it. "Most considerate," Holmes murmured, his eyes noting how the solicitor's explanation, while plausible, carried the rehearsed quality of a prepared defense. "And this Mr. Caelan Var, how came he to Sir Reginald's notice?" "Through Dr. Whitmore's recommendation," Avery replied with evident relief at the change of subject. The physician spoke of a continental engineer familiar with hygienic ventilation systems. Sir Reginald's breathing difficulties had become quite pronounced, and the improvement following the installation was immediate and remarkable. Holmes moved to the window, his sharp profile silhouetted against the fog-shrouded glass. "You encountered this gentleman personally?" "Once, quite by chance, in the entrance hall. Dark-featured with a distinctive scar upon his chin, as Mrs. Pemberton described. He carried the strong scent of mechanical oils and coal dust. We exchanged nothing more than a courteous greeting." Before Holmes could pursue this line of inquiry further, Mrs. Pemberton appeared at the threshold with unusual haste, her composed demeanour finally showing cracks of genuine alarm. "Gentlemen, forgive the intrusion, but Mrs. Mortlake has arrived in considerable distress. She insists upon speaking with the authorities immediately regarding a matter of pressing urgency." "Show the lady in directly," Holmes commanded, his eyes blazing with that familiar intensity that marked crucial moments in his investigations. The woman who entered bore the unmistakable signs of recent distress. Mrs. Lydia Mortlake appeared to be approaching her 40th year, with auburn hair arranged in evident haste and intelligent grey eyes that surveyed the chamber with barely concealed anxiety. Her travelling dress, though of excellent quality, showed signs of hurried preparation, and her gloved hands clutched a leather portfolio with visible tension. "Inspector Lestrade, Mr. Holmes," She began without preamble, her cultured voice carrying undertones of desperation. "I have come to report a most serious matter. I have received these." She withdrew from her portfolio 2 folded papers, both bearing the same cheap stationery and crude penmanship. Holmes accepted the documents with his customary delicacy, his trained eye immediately cataloguing their distinctive features. The first message read, "Decline the inheritance for the family's honor." The second proved more ominous, "Refuse or be exposed. The past burns easily. M.B." "Most illuminating," Holmes observed, holding the papers to the light and then to his nostrils. "The ink is common penny variety, but observe these minute specks of soot along the fold and this trace of paraffin on the lower edge. Where did you receive these communications, Mrs. Mortlake?" "Both were discovered upon my doorstep at dawn, without postal markings. My lodgings are situated near Euston Road, adjacent to a coal yard." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then moved with sudden purpose toward the bell cord. "I believe an examination of the heating apparatus may prove most instructive. Jameson," he addressed the butler, who appeared with his characteristic silent efficiency, "who has had access to the new ventilation system?" "Only young Timothy, sir. Mr. Varr provided him with detailed instructions and left a diagram in the boiler room. I have not myself interfered with the mechanisms." "Excellent. We shall inspect the boiler room immediately." The descent to the manor's basement revealed a meticulously maintained mechanical space, dominated by a modern heating apparatus and an intricate network of pipes extending throughout the building. Upon the wall hung a penciled diagram showing the ventilation modifications, including an auxiliary bypass marked specifically for the study register. Holmes examined the control lever with his magnifying glass, his expression brightening with satisfaction. "Observe, Watson, fresh vermilion wax upon this mechanism, identical to that adorning Mr. Avery's thumb. Someone with access to legal sealing materials has recently adjusted this ventilation control." The implication struck me with considerable force. The elaborate deception extended beyond the study itself, involving manipulation of the very air that had sustained the impossible flame. Moreover, the threatening letters suggested that our investigation had disturbed someone with both intimate knowledge of the household and a ruthless determination to protect their interests. "The game grows more complex with each revelation," Holmes observed, his voice carrying that note of eager anticipation that invariably preceded his most brilliant deductions. "We have identified our players and discovered their methods. Now we must determine which among them possesses both the technical expertise and the calculating ruthlessness to orchestrate such an elaborate scheme, and why they have chosen this moment to abandon subtlety for direct threats." Holmes's examination of the ventilation control had revealed far more than mechanical ingenuity. As we ascended from the basement, his restless energy suggested that the human drama was approaching its crucial phase. The vermilion wax upon the lever, identical to that adorning Mr. Avery's thumb, had established a direct connection between the solicitor and the elaborate deception, yet something in Holmes's manner indicated that our investigation had uncovered merely one thread in a far more complex web. "The continental hand in these mechanical diagrams is most instructive," Holmes observed, studying the penciled notations with his magnifying glass. "Luftzug and Nebenleitung, where an English engineer would write draft and bypass. Our mysterious Mr. Varr possessed authentic European training, lending credibility to his professional credentials." Mrs. Mortlake, who had remained silent during our mechanical investigation, finally spoke with evident strain. "Mr. Holmes, these threatening letters signed M.B. I fear I may know their origin. The initials belong to Martha Blackwood, Sir Reginald's estranged niece. She always resented his wealth, believing the family fortune should have been hers by right." Holmes's eyes blazed with sudden comprehension. Martha Blackwood, a woman of theatrical temperament and unconventional habits, I presume. Someone who might possess both the motivation and the audacity to orchestrate such an elaborate scheme. Indeed, Mrs. Mortlake replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She disappeared from family circles years ago, though rumours suggested she had fallen into disreputable company. Her knowledge of chemistry and mechanical arts was always remarkable for a woman of her station. Before Holmes could pursue this revelation further, young Timothy appeared with evident urgency, his honest features flushed from recent exertion. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen, but I discovered this beneath the coal scuttle while banking the furnace." He extended a folded paper bearing the same crude penmanship we had observed in the threatening communications. Holmes accepted the document with characteristic delicacy, his trained eye immediately cataloguing its distinctive features. The message proved both brief and ominous. The ventilation must be adjusted precisely at midnight. The flame dies with the secret. M.B. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, examining the paper's watermark against the lamplight. Someone has been using the basement as a communication point, relying upon Timothy's regular duties to ensure discovery. The timing suggests immediate action is contemplated. Inspector Lestrade, his professional instincts finally aroused, voiced growing concern. "Holmes, if this Martha Blackwood means mischief tonight, shouldn't we summon additional constables?" "Patience, Inspector. Our adversary has already revealed more than intended." Holmes moved toward the study with renewed purpose, his keen mind evidently synthesizing the accumulated evidence into a coherent pattern. The basement communications, the precise timing, the growing desperation, all suggest someone operating under considerable pressure. As we re-entered Sir Reginald's study, an extraordinary sight greeted us. Fresh smoke curled from the grate, where charred paper fragments still glowed among carefully arranged ashes. The brass candlestick, once again, bore a small, defiant flame, and the wall safe stood slightly ajar. "Someone has returned," Holmes announced with grim satisfaction, moving swiftly to examine the evidence. He lifted a partially burned document fragment with his tweezers, studying the remnants with intense concentration. 2 different waxes in these ashes, legal sealing compound mixed with a balsamic resin not used by solicitors. 2 hands, 2 participants. The implications struck me with considerable force. Our investigation had disturbed someone with both intimate knowledge of the household and desperate determination to protect their interests. The elaborate deception was unraveling, forcing the conspirators into increasingly bold actions. Holmes moved to the window, noting fresh smears of blackened grease upon the latch, and the oval impression of a careful hand wiped clear upon the glass. Our visitor entered through this window, adjusted the ventilation to reignite the treated candle, and attempted to destroy incriminating evidence. The theatrical impossibility was being maintained even as we uncovered its mechanisms. At this crucial moment, Mrs. Pemberton appeared at the threshold with unusual haste, her composed demeanour finally showing cracks of genuine alarm. "Forgive the intrusion, gentlemen, but Dr. Whitmore has arrived unexpectedly. He requests an immediate audience regarding what he terms a matter of urgent medical significance." Holmes's eyes flashed with that peculiar intensity that marked his most brilliant deductions. "Show Dr. Whitmore in directly, Mrs. Pemberton. I believe his arrival is precisely what our investigation requires to illuminate the final elements of this remarkable conspiracy." The game was approaching its most crucial phase, and I sensed that the good doctor's unexpected appearance would provide the key to unraveling the entire elaborate deception. Dr. Whitmore entered the study with evident haste, his usually composed demeanour betraying signs of considerable agitation. His medical bag bore fresh scratches along its leather surface, and I observed that his typically immaculate appearance showed subtle indications of recent distress. His intelligent eyes, magnified behind wire-rimmed spectacles, surveyed the chamber with particular attention to the rekindled candle and the smouldering remnants in the grate. "Gentlemen," he began without preamble, his professional bearing barely concealing underlying anxiety, "I have come regarding a most disturbing development that bears directly upon Sir Reginald's final arrangements. This morning I received an unexpected visit from Martha Blackwood, a woman I had not encountered for over 15 years, yet who displayed an alarming familiarity with the intimate details of her uncle's medical condition." Holmes stepped forward with that predatory grace that marked his moments of greatest intensity, his keen eyes already cataloguing the physician's appearance with characteristic precision. "And what prompted Miss Blackwood's sudden interest in medical matters, Doctor?" "She demanded detailed information about the timing of Sir Reginald's death and whether I had observed any unusual circumstances in the study during my final visits. When I refused, citing professional confidentiality, she became remarkably insistent, displaying knowledge of his symptoms that suggested she had been observing his decline with considerable attention." Dr. Whitmore paused, removing his spectacles to clean them with trembling fingers. More disturbing still, she inquired specifically about my recommendation of the Continental engineer. The implications of this revelation struck me with considerable force, yet Holmes's expression suggested he had already anticipated this connection. "The engineer whose credentials you provided, Doctor, tell me, do you recall the precise circumstances of that recommendation?" Dr. Whitmore's composure faltered visibly. "A most peculiar matter, Mr. Holmes. I discovered among my correspondence a letter bearing my professional letterhead, requesting consultation regarding hygienic air circulation for a patient with respiratory difficulties. The document appeared entirely authentic, complete with my signature and official seal. However, upon reflection, I have no recollection of writing such a communication." "A forgery of considerable skill," Holmes observed, his eyes blazing with that familiar intensity as another piece of the elaborate puzzle fell into place. "Someone possessed both intimate knowledge of your professional practices and the technical expertise to reproduce your credentials convincingly." The physician nodded grimly, his weathered features creased with growing concern. 3 months ago my consulting rooms were burglarized. Nothing of obvious value was taken, but my desk was thoroughly searched, and several sheets of letterhead disappeared along with my official seal. I reported the matter to the police, though they suggested it was likely the work of common thieves seeking items to pawn. Holmes moved to examine the charred fragments in the grate with renewed purpose, his magnifying glass revealing details that had escaped our earlier observation. Among the ashes, he extracted a partially burned document bearing the ghostly impression of an official medical seal. The forged recommendation, I presume, now being hastily destroyed to eliminate evidence of the conspiracy. "But, Doctor," I interjected, noting the fresh abrasions upon Whitmore's knuckles and the faint smear of soot upon his cuff, "you returned to the manor yesterday evening after the body was discovered. Mrs. Pemberton mentioned your visit, though the study had already been sealed by Inspector Lestrade's orders." Dr. Whitmore's face grew pale, his gaze involuntarily flickering toward the window where Holmes had observed fresh smears of grease upon the latch. "I merely wished to confirm that no foul play had occurred, to ensure my medical diagnosis remained sound. The circumstances were so extraordinary that I felt compelled to make one final examination." Holmes straightened from his investigation of the ashes, his sharp features illuminated by the dancing flames of the impossible candle. "Yet your examination extended beyond medical observation, did it not? The fresh tallow upon the window latch, the carefully adjusted ventilation that rekindled this treated wick, the selective burning of documents, all suggest someone with intimate knowledge of both the household's routines and the mechanical deception that has sustained our mysterious flame. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusations. Holmes continued his methodical examination, noting how the physician's explanations, while individually plausible, formed a pattern of involvement that extended far beyond innocent medical concern. "The theatrical elements become increasingly apparent," Holmes announced, holding a fragment of resinous material to the lamplight. "Balsamic resin mixed with legal sealing wax, evidence of at least 2 participants in this elaborate performance. One possessed legal expertise, the other theatrical knowledge sufficient to create convincing supernatural effects." Inspector Lestrade, his professional instincts finally aroused by the mounting evidence, voiced growing concern. "Holmes, if multiple conspirators are involved, shouldn't we summon additional constables immediately?" "Patience, Inspector. Our adversaries have already revealed more than they intended through their growing desperation." Holmes moved toward the study door with renewed purpose, his restless energy suggesting that the investigation was approaching its crucial phase. The midnight adjustment mentioned in the basement communication was not mere theatricality. It represents the final act of a carefully orchestrated deception that has been months in the planning. The game was indeed approaching its climax, and I sensed that the revelations we had uncovered represented merely the surface of a conspiracy far more complex than its supernatural trappings had initially suggested. The impossible candle continued to burn with its stubborn persistence, illuminating secrets that someone was prepared to kill to protect. Holmes's piercing gaze remained fixed upon Dr. Whitmore as the physician's explanations grew increasingly strained under scrutiny. The mounting evidence of his involvement in the elaborate deception had created a web of circumstantial proof that even the most charitable interpretation could not entirely explain away. Yet something in my friend's manner suggested that the good doctor represented merely one thread in a far more complex tapestry of human motivation and carefully orchestrated deceit. "The pattern emerges with remarkable clarity," Holmes announced, moving to the center of the study with that characteristic energy that marked his moments of greatest intellectual triumph. "We have before us not a single mastermind, but a conspiracy of necessity, each participant driven by distinct motives, yet united in their need to manipulate the circumstances surrounding Sir Reginald's death." He gestured toward the brass candlestick with its persistent flame, then to the charred fragments in the grate. "Dr. Whitmore provided unwitting legitimacy through his stolen credentials, which enabled our continental engineer to gain access and install the sophisticated ventilation system. Mr. Avery contributed his legal expertise and sealing materials, ensuring the codicil's authenticity while maintaining the theatrical elements that would discourage investigation. Yet the driving force behind this elaborate performance was someone with both intimate knowledge of the family and the ruthless determination to subvert Sir Reginald's final wishes. Mrs. Mortlake, who had remained silent throughout these revelations, finally spoke with evident strain. "Martha Blackwood possesses both the theatrical knowledge to conceive such a deception and the bitter resentment to execute it. Her letters made clear her intention to prevent my inheritance by any means necessary." "Precisely," Holmes replied, his eyes blazing with that familiar intensity. Miss Blackwood recognized that her uncle's acknowledgement of his natural daughter represented not merely a financial loss but a permanent stain upon the family reputation she considered herself bound to protect. The impossible candle served her purposes admirably, creating an atmosphere of supernatural mystery that would either delay legal proceedings or provide grounds for challenging the will's validity. Inspector Lestrade, his practical mind finally grasping the conspiracy's scope, voiced growing concern. But Holmes, if multiple parties are involved and Miss Blackwood grows desperate, shouldn't we expect further attempts at deception or even violence? Indeed, Inspector. Which is why we must prepare for her inevitable return. Holmes moved to examine the study's window with renewed purpose, noting the fresh scratches upon the latch and the faint impressions in the soft earth beneath. The basement communication regarding midnight adjustment was not mere theatricality. It represents the final act of a performance that has been months in the planning. With methodical precision, Holmes began preparing what could only be described as an elaborate trap. From his coat pocket emerged a small tin of French talc, which he applied in a thin line before the wall, safe, and along the windowsill. The outer latch received a whisper of lamp black, while a hair-fine thread stretched from the safe's handle to a tiny bell concealed behind the bronze figurine upon the mantel. "Watson," he instructed with quiet authority, "position yourself behind the heavy curtains beside the window. Inspector, your constables must be placed with absolute precision, one in the shrubbery beneath this window, another in the basement corridor by the boiler room, and a third at the main entrance. No movement, no sound until the trap is sprung." Dr. Whitmore, his agitation barely contained, pressed forward with obvious anxiety. "Mr. Holmes, surely my involvement was minimal and unwitting. The forged credentials will be addressed in due course, Doctor. For now, your presence may prove useful. When our principal antagonist arrives, Miss Blackwood will expect to find allies among those she believes complicit in the original deception." As the great clock in the entrance hall chimed 11, Holmes extinguished the gas lamps, leaving only the flickering candlelight to illuminate our chamber. The impossible flame continued its stubborn persistence, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock the very foundations of natural law, even as we prepared to expose the human ingenuity behind its defiant existence. "The midnight hour approaches," Holmes murmured, settling into concealment with that predatory stillness I had witnessed so many times before. "Miss Blackwood believes the final adjustment will extinguish both the candle and the secrets it has illuminated. Instead, it will provide the illumination necessary to expose the entire elaborate conspiracy she has constructed around her uncle's natural death." The study fell into expectant silence, broken only by the soft whisper of the treated wick and the distant sound of London's fog-shrouded streets. Somewhere in that impenetrable darkness, Martha Blackwood was making her final approach, unaware that her impossible candle was about to cast its light upon the very human passions that had driven this remarkable deception from its theatrical beginning to its inevitable conclusion. The game, as Holmes would say, had reached its most crucial phase, and I found myself marveling at the intricate web of human motivation that had transformed a simple inheritance dispute into one of the most elaborate mysteries we had ever encountered. The minutes crawled past with excruciating deliberation as we maintained our vigil in the darkened study, the oppressive silence broken only by the persistent whisper of the impossible candle and the distant chiming of London's church bells marking the approach of midnight. Holmes remained motionless behind Sir Reginald's desk, his sharp profile barely visible in the flickering light, while I pressed myself against the heavy curtains beside the window, every nerve taut with anticipation. At precisely 17 minutes before the midnight hour, the faint scrape of metal against glass announced our quarry's arrival. Through the window's edge, I observed a dark figure manipulating the latch with practiced efficiency, movements that betrayed both intimate familiarity with the mechanism and considerable anxiety about the task ahead. The oval pane yielded with the softest sigh, and immediately Holmes's hair-fine thread quivered, causing the hidden bell to emit the faintest chirrup from behind the bronze figurine. Martha Blackwood slipped through the window with surprising agility, her dark clothing allowing her to blend seamlessly with the chamber's shadows. She proved to be a woman of perhaps 45 years, her once elegant features hardened by years of resentment, auburn hair streaked with premature silver beneath a wide-brimmed hat. In her gloved hands she carried a small leather satchel and what appeared to be a peculiar brass instrument fitted with multiple valves and gauges clearly designed for precise adjustment of gas flow. Her attention focused immediately upon the wall safe, which she approached with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with its contents. Holmes's carefully placed talc betrayed her footsteps as she moved, though she remained unaware of our presence. With practiced skill, she manipulated the combination lock using the chalk marks that had guided her previous visits, her movements suggesting this was a well-rehearsed performance. She moved next toward the skirting board, where a neat ivory slider lay hidden beneath the shadow of the Chippendale desk leg. As her fingers found the mechanism, Holmes chose that moment to emerge from concealment with characteristic, dramatic flair. "I believe, Miss Blackwood," his calm, resonant voice cut through the darkness, "that your theatrical performance has reached its final act." The woman spun with remarkable composure, her intelligent grey eyes immediately cataloguing the trap into which she had walked. Rather than display panic, she straightened with defiant dignity, her grip tightening upon the brass instrument she carried. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume?" she said in cultured tones edged with bitter resentment. "Your reputation for interfering in family matters precedes you. You understand nothing of what you have stumbled into." "On the contrary," Holmes replied with that courteous implacability which few could resist, "I understand precisely the elaborate deception you have orchestrated, the continental engineer, the forged medical credentials, the chemically treated candle designed to burn with supernatural persistence, all elements in a carefully constructed illusion." Inspector Lestrade emerged from behind the door with his constables while I stepped forward from my concealment. The confrontation was complete, yet Martha Blackwood's composure remained largely intact, her eyes flashing with something approaching admiration for Holmes's deductive abilities. "The family reputation, Mr. Holmes," she declared with fierce determination, "generations of respectability threatened by an old man's sentimental weakness. The Blackwood name has stood for integrity and moral leadership in this community for over a century." Holmes moved to the center of the study, his voice taking on that measured cadence I knew so well when he unraveled the most complex mysteries. "Your intricate performance, while ingenious, has been thoroughly exposed, Miss Blackwood. Allow me to illuminate each element of your remarkable deception." He gestured toward the persistent candle. This wick, treated with saltpeter and other chemicals, was designed for prolonged, low-smoke combustion. Coupled with the carefully modified ventilation system, commissioned through Dr. Whitmore's unwitting assistance using credentials stolen from his burgled office, it created the illusion of supernatural persistence. Moving to the study door, Holmes continued his exposition. "The sealed room represented your masterstroke of misdirection. Fishing gut, meticulously threaded through the keyhole from outside, allowed you to manipulate the key and create the impression of a chamber locked from within. Your goal was to generate sufficient mystery around Sir Reginald's death to challenge the codicil's validity." Holmes indicated the wall safe. "The chalk marks were your own creation, Miss Blackwood, a record of the combination you believed Mr. Avery was simply memorizing in his professional diligence. You required access not to destroy the codicil entirely, but to ensure its contents could be suppressed or discredited when necessary." "But the engineer?" Lestrade interjected, still grappling with the deception's complexity. Holmes smiled with evident satisfaction. "There was no Continental engineer, Inspector. Miss Blackwood herself, with the aid of a collodion appliance creating a convincing scar upon her chin, impersonated the mysterious Mr. Caelan Var. her theatrical background provided the necessary skills for such a transformation. Martha Blackwood's mask of composure finally cracked as the completeness of her exposure became apparent. "The inheritance will be challenged regardless," she declared desperately. "No court will recognize the legitimacy of a relationship that brings scandal upon an honorable family name." "Perhaps," Holmes conceded with characteristic mildness, "though I suspect Mrs. Mortlake possesses sufficient documentation to support her claim. More immediately relevant is your conspiracy to obstruct legal proceedings through elaborate deception, a matter requiring extensive explanation to the authorities." As the constables moved to secure her, Miss Blackwood made one final desperate attempt to destroy the codicil, lunging toward the fireplace with the legal documents clutched in her hands. Holmes intercepted her with surprising agility, his lean frame proving more than adequate to restrain her determined assault upon the evidence. The impossible candle flickered once, as though acknowledging the drama it had illuminated, then continued its stubborn burning with that persistence which had first drawn our attention to this remarkable case. The supernatural mystery had been revealed as the most human of deceptions, a desperate attempt to preserve family honor that had instead exposed the darkness capable of dwelling within even the most respectable hearts. As the handcuffs clicked into place, I found myself marveling at the intricate web of human motivation that had transformed a simple inheritance dispute into one of the most elaborate mysteries we had ever encountered. The game, as Holmes would say, had reached its decisive conclusion, though I sensed that the final act of our drama still awaited its proper staging. The dawn that followed Martha Blackwood's arrest broke grey and sullen over Hampstead, though the persistent fog that had shrouded London for days finally began to lift as Inspector Lestrade completed the formal procedures. Holmes and I remained in Sir Reginald's study as the impossible candle finally exhausted its chemically enhanced persistence, the flame guttering to extinction with a soft sigh that seemed to mark the conclusion of one of our most intricate investigations. "The human element proves far more fascinating than any supernatural mystery," Holmes observed, settling into the leather chair where Sir Reginald had breathed his last. Miss Blackwood's elaborate performance required months of careful preparation, intimate knowledge of household routines, and considerable technical expertise. Yet her fundamental miscalculation lay in underestimating the persistence of human affection. Inspector Lestrade, though visibly relieved, still wore an expression of profound bewilderment. "Holmes, to think all that elaborate deception over family honor. The woman's ingenuity was remarkable, if misdirected." "Indeed, Inspector. Miss Blackwood possessed genuine intelligence and theatrical talent that might have achieved considerable legitimate success. Her downfall lay not in any lack of ability, but in her fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. She believed that family reputation could be preserved through deception, yet failed to recognize that true honor lies in accepting difficult truths with dignity." Mrs. Pemberton appeared with the Morning Post, her composed demeanor finally restored now that the household's terrible uncertainty had been resolved. Among the correspondence lay official confirmation from Sir Reginald's bank regarding Mrs. Mortlake's inheritance, along with detailed documentation that would satisfy even the most skeptical legal scrutiny. Mr. Avery's involvement troubled me considerably, I confessed, as we reviewed the accumulated evidence. His explanations seemed plausible individually, yet formed a pattern of suspicious behavior. The solicitor's guilt lay primarily in professional negligence rather than criminal conspiracy, Holmes replied with characteristic precision. His nervous handling of the sealing wax, his familiarity with the safe combination, all reflected a man struggling to maintain professional standards while managing extraordinary circumstances. Miss Blackwood exploited his anxiety masterfully, using his legitimate access to create the impression of broader complicity. Dr. Whitmore, still pale from the shock of revelation, approached with evident contrition. "My stolen credentials enabled this entire deception, Mr. Holmes. I feel responsible for unwittingly facilitating such elaborate fraud." "Your culpability lies in carelessness with confidential materials, Doctor. Though your genuine concern for Sir Reginald's health lent credibility to the ventilation modifications, you were manipulated by someone who understood that the most effective deceptions incorporate elements of absolute truth." As we prepared to depart Blackwood Manor, Holmes paused at the threshold, his sharp features illuminated by the morning sun finally breaking through London's perpetual fog. "One element of this case requires final clarification, Watson. The timing of Sir Reginald's natural death was no mere coincidence." The implication struck me with considerable force. "You suggest Martha deliberately hastened his decline?" "I suggest that Dr. Whitmore's stolen correspondence included more than letterhead and official seals. Miss Blackwood's theatrical knowledge enabled convincing supernatural effects, but her true expertise lay in understanding human weakness and exploiting it with calculated precision. The mild cardiac stimulant she administered over several weeks accelerated Sir Reginald's natural decline, ensuring his death coincided with her elaborate preparations. Within days, Martha Blackwood faced additional charges and received 15 years penal servitude. Mrs. Lydia Mortlake inherited her father's estate with full legal recognition, establishing a charitable foundation for disadvantaged women's education. Dr. Whitmore faced professional censure, but retained his medical license after demonstrating genuine remorse. Mr. Avery suffered no criminal charges, though his nervous disposition never fully recovered from his unwitting participation in the deception. As our hansom cab carried us back through London's awakening streets, Holmes maintained his characteristic silence, his restless mind already turning toward future challenges. The city emerged from its foggy shroud like a metaphor for truth emerging from deception. "The case presents several instructive elements, Watson," Holmes finally observed. "Human ingenuity, when driven by desperate motivation, can create illusions of remarkable sophistication. Family honor, when corrupted by pride and resentment, may drive individuals to extraordinary lengths, yet the most elaborate theatrical performances ultimately collapse when subjected to methodical scientific analysis. It is a curious thing," Holmes continued, his gaze drifting to the clearing sky. "How often the most intricate deceptions are born not of grand criminal ambition, but of the petty jealousies and misguided pride that fester within domestic life. The human heart remains the most inscrutable and dangerous of all mysteries." He paused, a slight smile playing on his lips. Still, this case had its moments of scientific novelty. A chemically treated wick, precisely calibrated ventilation, and fishing gut for lock manipulation. One might almost call it an illuminating experience. As we ascended to our familiar Baker Street chambers, Holmes retrieved his pipe from the mantelpiece with that characteristic energy that marked the conclusion of a successful investigation. The candle that refused to die ultimately illuminated the very human passions that drive individuals to extraordinary lengths of deception. In the end, Watson, no mystery proves truly supernatural when subjected to methodical analysis and an understanding of human nature in all its remarkable complexity. The Morning Post awaited with news of a curious problem concerning a missing emerald and a certain operatic diva, another puzzle to engage Holmes's restless intellect. The impossible flame had been extinguished, but the light of truth it had ultimately revealed would remain with us long after the last traces of that remarkable deception had faded into memory. The game, as my friend would say, was most decidedly concluded, though London's endless supply of human folly would ensure that our investigative partnership would never lack for fascinating challenges to illuminate the darker corners of the human condition.